In December of 2005, a young woman walked down a sidewalk in New York City. There were Christmas decorations on all the buildings and Christmas lights. I mean, it was very festive. But as she walked along, she glanced over at a newspaper stand and she saw something on the front page of that paper that literally made her stop in her tracks. And not because it was festive. It was awful. Right there on the front page was a picture of the one thing in her life that she'd hoped she would never, ever see again. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place. Because that's all we do and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, on the next extremely hot day, sneak into the like button's house and jack their thermostat all the way up to the highest setting, and then once it's there, rip the thermostat off the wall. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the evening of Sunday, November 27, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine would lean towards the mirror to put on her eyeliner inside the bathroom of her small apartment in New York City. Catherine's phone was sitting on the bathroom counter and she heard it buzz, but she didn't even look to see who was calling. She didn't have time to talk to anyone because she had to finish getting ready for her 7 o'clock shift at work. So Catherine had moved to New York City from Ohio 3 years earlier to pursue her dream of becoming a dancer on Broadway. But everything here was so expensive that in addition to chasing her dream, she also had to work 3 different jobs just to make ends meet. Now, 2 of those jobs were pretty standard. She worked as a waitress and also taught children's dance classes. But tonight, she was getting ready to go to her 3rd job, and this job was not really standard at all. In fact, to her, she was sort of embarrassed about it, and because of that, she was keeping it a secret from almost everybody in her life. Her 3rd job was working as a topless dancer at a strip club near Times Square called Flash Dancers. Catherine honestly hated the work, but it paid really well. And if she wanted to have her shot at Broadway, she needed to pay for voice lessons and dance classes. Now, she did live in Manhattan, which was the most expensive part of the already very expensive city, and she knew that she could save some money if she just moved to a neighborhood where rent was cheaper. But when she had first moved to New York, she had lived in a less expensive neighborhood for that reason, and unfortunately, her landlord had sexually assaulted her. The experience had been so traumatic that Catherine had, at the time, considered just leaving New York and going back to Ohio and just being done with this place. But in the end, she had decided to stay in New York and continue chasing her dream. Now, she did move within New York. She got in this apartment in Manhattan because it was a lot safer, and she also got a roommate to help with the cost. His name was David Hahn. He was 23, and he was one of Catherine's friends from back home in Ohio. But at this very moment, David was not inside the apartment. He'd gone outside to get his car so he could doctor Catherine to work. Catherine finished her makeup and left the bathroom, and as she walked through the living room, she stepped over a black dog that was sleeping on the floor. The dog was not Catherine's, and it actually was not David's either. David was a part-time dog sitter, so this dog was just staying with them while its owners were out of town. Just like Catherine, David also had a bunch of part-time jobs to help make ends meet. When he wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a hotel just up the street from their apartment. Now, Catherine and David had actually been romantic at one point. They had dated for a little while. But these days, they were just roommates living together to split the bills. Although secretly, Catherine did sometimes wonder if, maybe they should give it another shot to try being a couple again. Thanksgiving had been a few days ago, and instead of going home to Ohio like she usually did, Catherine had stayed in New York and celebrated with David. And it had been a really nice time. Plus, David knew about Catherine's 3rd job of working at Flash Dancers and he didn't judge her for it. And Catherine felt like a lot of people did. So she liked that about him. But the biggest hurdle that Catherine could see to potentially rekindling their relationship was the fact that David disliked basically every man she met, whether she was dating them or not. He just did not like them. Now, some of these guys she could understand why David, didn't like them. there was this guy, Joe, that she had dated briefly, who really she'd only met because he was a patron of her strip club. But then there were people like Paul, who was a personal trainer at Catherine's gym, who she'd only seen off and on and who was nothing but nice to David. And even though Paul and Catherine were not dating now and mostly just spoke on the phone periodically, David still insisted that Paul was a creep. He just did not like the guy. But for now, Catherine figured, you know what? I'm not gonna figure out my entire romantic life. I just need to finish getting ready and go downstairs so she wouldn't keep David waiting. So Catherine went into her bedroom and began getting dressed, and that's when she heard the dog start barking at something in the living room. And so, curious, Catherine walked in that direction to see what was going on. A little while later, Catherine's roommate, David, walked quickly along the sidewalk to get his car, which was parked a ways up the street. He was out of breath by the time he reached it. He knew he had to hurry, so he jumped in and he drove back to the apartment building. And he called Catherine as he pulled up out front. When she didn't answer, he threw on his hazards and he climbed back out to go into the building to go get her. And he had just made it up the flight of stairs that led to his second-floor apartment, and he was going down the hallway when he saw something that made him come to an abrupt stop. It was that black dog that he was dog-sitting. Somehow, it had gotten out of the apartment and was just standing there in the shared hallway outside of his apartment door. David blinked and then realized that his neighbor, a man he rarely interacted with named Brad Stewart, was standing right behind the dog, and Brad was holding a leash that was clearly clipped onto the dog's collar. For a second, Brad looked surprised, and David was just completely confused about why this guy had the dog that he was dog-sitting on a leash. But then Brad told David that he had found the dog wandering around, recognized it as David's, and brought it back to his apartment. Brad said he had just knocked on David's apartment door, but so far nobody had answered. So at this point, David understood, why Brad has the dog, but he didn't know why the dog was out of the apartment in the first place. But he kept that to himself and just thanked Brad, took the leash, and then stepped over to the door of his apartment, numbered to D. The apartment door was shut, but when he turned the handle, he found that it was unlocked. David couldn't remember if he had left it unlocked or not, so he just opened it and he called out Catherine's name. But there was no answer, which was weird. So he stepped inside. Now, he didn't see Catherine, but he did see the door to her bedroom was slightly cracked open. So he walked over to it and he called out to her again. And then when she didn't call back, he tried pushing her to open. But the door didn't really open. It instead swung maybe a few inches and then stopped, and David felt resistance on the other side. Like something maybe on the ground was holding the door from opening all the way. And so now, with all these strange things happening, David's starting to feel pretty worried. And so, the surge of adrenaline came over him and he just shoved the door open. And he stuck his head in and he looked inside. And when he saw what was in there, he immediately pulled back, turned around, ran into the hallway, and he called the police. A half an hour later, around 7:30 p.m., an NYPD detective named Stephen Getz walked up a flight of stairs at an apartment building in Manhattan. This part of the city was known to be extremely safe. Homicides never really happened here. But if the 911 caller had been telling the truth, Getz knew that a potential grisly murder scene was in fact waiting for him in apartment to D. When he reached the second-floor landing, he saw there were already a few other NYPD officers on the scene. And one of them was speaking to this young skinny guy standing in the hallway who looked really upset, and he was holding a leash that was connected to a black dog. Another officer walked over to Getz and filled him in. He said the man that was being spoken to was the victim's roommate, David Hahn, and he was the one who had found the body and called 911. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment in the back bedroom. Getz nodded and then walked down the hallway past David and the dog toward the apartment door. His plan was to look at the scene himself before he began questioning anyone. Getz put on some disposable rubber gloves and checked out the door frame to the actual apartment, and then he also looked at the door itself, but he didn't see any damage that could signify first entry. So he stepped into the apartment and he saw that the small living room was a little bit messy, but it wasn't like it had been ransacked or something. You know, the futon was pulled out and there were some men's clothes strewn around, but it sort of looked like a typical place that people live. And so Getz walked through the living room, being careful not to disturb anything, and he went towards what he assumed was the bedroom where the body was. The door was open just wide enough that Getz was able to get through. And when he stepped through and was inside the room, he saw blood everywhere. It was all over the walls and the furniture, and the room itself looked like it had been completely torn apart. One of the dresser drawers was open and lots of women's clothing was scattered all over the place. And the mattress had been completely taken off the bed frame and was now lying on the floor. And that's actually what was blocking the door from opening all the way. And then in the middle of the room, in a pool of blood, lay the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her for a closer look. She was wearing a t-shirt and underwear, and the t-shirt had a very obvious shoe print on it, like whoever had killed Catherine had stepped on her. And there were at least a dozen stab wounds all over her body. There were also what appeared to be defensive wounds on her hands and arms, which Getz knew meant she must have fought back against her attacker. But the worst injuries she sustained were definitely to her neck. Whoever had killed her had slit her throat so deeply that they had almost decapitated her. And so, to Getz right away, it seemed like whoever killed Catherine had been in an absolute rage. At that point, Getz heard footsteps coming from behind him, and he stood up and he turned around to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. Now, the blocked door was making maneuvering and out of this bedroom pretty difficult. So one of the first things the forensics team did was to pick up the mattress and carefully lean it against the wall so the bedroom door could now swing open all the way. Then Detective Getz just stepped back and let the forensics team get to work. He watched as they pulled that shoe print off the t-shirt Catherine was wearing. And then also there was a second identical shoe print that was on her bed sheets that they also grabbed. To Getz, both of these prints did appear to be from the exact same shoe. And to the naked eye, these prints appeared, at least to Getz, to belong to very likely an average-sized man. Detective Getz was immediately curious about something, so he stepped out of the bedroom into the living room and he quickly found a couple pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor. And although the tread of these shoes did not match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom, they did appear to be the exact same size. An hour later, at about 8:30 p.m. On November 27, 2005, Detective Getz sat down at a table inside of an interview room at the NYPD's 19th precinct. And once he did, he handed a bottle of water across the table to David Hahn, the roommate of the murder victim and Detective Getz's current #1 suspect. There had been no sign of forced entry at the apartment that David and Catherine shared, which meant that Catherine's killer either had access to the apartment or was let inside by somebody who did. And the murder had been committed with a knife in a really savage way that struck Getz as being a personally motivated attack. Even though Catherine's bedroom had been trashed, nothing seemed to have been stolen. And because Catherine had been found partially undressed, there was potentially a sexual motive at play as well. So, Getz's working theory here was that this murder was committed by a man who knew the victim well and had easy access to her living space. And David fit that profile to a T. Plus, he apparently wore the same size shoe as the killer. Although as Detective Getz settled into his chair and brought out his notepad, he did a quick scan of David's forearms and his hands, and he saw that David had no visible cuts, scrapes, or bruises. The detective thought that Catherine's killer likely would have some injuries there because she had obviously been fighting for her life. She would have left a mark on them. But Getz didn't say anything about this to David. Instead, he just leaned forward and he asked David to walk him through what had happened that day. David's hands were shaking a bit, but he took a deep breath to calm himself, and he said that he had been at the apartment with Catherine that night until about 6:40 p.m. Anyway, that was when he had left to go get his car so he could come back and Dr. Catherine to her 7 o'clock shift at Flash Dancers. But he said retrieving his car had taken longer than he expected because on the way he had run into some of his co-workers from his doorman job and he had stopped to chat with them. He said after he had done that and he had gotten his car and he went back to the apartment, he had expected Catherine to be waiting outside by the curb, but when he got there, there was no sign of her and she didn't answer when he called her. So David said he'd ultimately gone inside and ran upstairs to the apartment. And in the hallway, he had found his neighbor Brad, who was oddly holding the leash of the black dog that David was supposed to be looking after her. And then David said he went into his apartment, and that's when he found Catherine's body. David said he had called 911 right away. It was right around 7 p.m. And at this, Getz stopped writing on the notepad and just looked up at David. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he'd only been out of the apartment for 20 minutes. In that narrow window of time, Catherine had been brutally murdered and the killer had also escaped. It honestly sounded like one of the worst alibis Getz had ever heard. But he didn't want David to know just how close he was to getting arrested for murder because he didn't want David to get scared and stop talking. So Getz kept his tone very sympathetic as he asked how long David had known Catherine for. David said they had met back in Ohio a few years ago while Catherine was visiting her hometown. They'd begun dating and he had ultimately moved out to New York to live with her, but it wasn't long before Catherine broke up with him and then asked him to move out. But David said he had not been able to afford his own place, so he had started sleeping in his car. And Catherine had felt bad about that, so she had ultimately let him move back in on the condition that he slept on the food and out in the living room. By now, Detective Getz, his pen was flying across the page because David was not just Catherine's roommate. He was her ex-boyfriend. An ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see Catherine alive and discovered her body. Getz was more confident than ever that he was sitting across from Catherine's killer. He told David that everything he was saying was incredibly helpful, but right now he needed to go check on something. David agreed to wait and Getz stood up to leave, but he stopped at the door and he asked David for one last thing before he left. He asked what his shoe size was, and without missing a beat, David answered that he wore a 10.5. Getz jotted this down, and then he left. What he hadn't told David was the reason he was stepping out of the room was to go get some information from the NYPD's forensics team in the uniform, officers who were currently questioning David's neighbors. And once Getz had that information, he was going to use it to try to catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, so about 3:00 p.m. the next day, Getz was sitting at his desk feeling completely exhausted, but was pounding yet another cup of coffee. He'd been up all night interrogating David, who was still literally sitting right down the hall in the interrogation room. And also, Getz had been going back and forth with the forensics team and other officers and detectives who were out in the neighborhood, and he still had loads more to do before he could finally go to sleep. Right now, Getz was going over a new batch of reports from the uniformed officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building, asking the neighbors if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. And just like Getz had hoped, the information they were getting did contradict pieces of David's story. David claimed that he had left the apartment at about 6:40 p.m. and said that at that time Catherine was fine. But two neighbors said they heard screams coming from the apartment before 6:40 p.m. The man in the unit directly above David and Catherine said he had heard 3 screams at 6:28 p.m. And the people in the unit next door to David and Catherine said they'd heard screaming, barking, and the sound of furniture moving around even earlier, between 5:45 and 6:00 p.m. Now, none of these neighbors had done anything about these noises because the noises had stopped pretty quickly. And then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had said he had found the black dog. Brad told police that when he ran into David in the hallway, it was sometime between 6:00 and 6:30. But David had said that he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body at about 7:00 p.m., a full half hour later. Now, Getz knew witnesses were often bad with time, and in a dense New York City apartment building, there were lots of noises coming from lots of units, but still, it looked to him like David's alibi had serious problems. And so the detective sat back and had some more coffee, and then his phone rang. He picked it up, and it was the forensics team with an update about those shoe prints that were on Catherine's shirt and the bed sheets. And the prints were indeed left behind by a roughly average-sized man. They were a men's size 10.5, and this was the exact size Getz knew David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and then rushed back to the interrogation room to have yet another chat with David Hahn. This time, though, Getz did not offer David a water. He just sat down, and he confronted him with all these new facts. He told David that the killer's shoe prints were exactly his shoe size, that his neighbors had heard screams before David had supposedly left the building, and that Brad said he'd seen David in the hallway at least a half an hour earlier than David had claimed he was there. Getz leaned in and told David that there were also security cameras in the apartment building, and his officers were already in the process of getting access to that footage. So, if David had anything to say, he better say it now. Getz watched as David's expression went from exhausted to clearly afraid. It seemed like this might be the first time that David realized the police truly did not believe his story. And after a second of just stunned silence, David insisted that he had not killed Catherine, and he begged Getz to believe him. But when Getz just glared back at him, completely unmoved, David launched into a whole new story, one he had not mentioned at all over the last 20 hours of interrogation. David said Catherine knew this guy named Paul Cortez. She had dated him, but David had always thought he was kind of a creep. And David said Catherine had told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So, David said the police really ought to go investigate Paul, not him. To Getz, this seemed like a desperate last-minute attempt to cast suspicion on somebody else, but he knew he did have to follow every lead. So he did write down Paul's name and told David they'd look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the evening, David was still in the interrogation room, and reporters from all the daily papers were beginning to assemble right outside. The following morning, the story of Catherine's murder and pictures of her smiling face were all over the news. The front page of the New York Daily News carried a headline that made Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper Inside." The article reported that Catherine's family hadn't known she was working as a topless dancer until they literally flew to the city from Ohio to collect her body. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He wasn't convinced that Catherine's line of work had anything to do with her murder, but the papers seemed intent on running with it, and a media circus was like the last thing Getz wanted. His team was already under enough pressure to make an arrest as it was, and it was going to be even harder to do their jobs now that a bunch of tips were going to be flooding in from the public from all this media. Getz put down the newspaper, got up from his desk, and walked down the hall to the interrogation room. He'd finished the day yesterday feeling pretty confident that David was his murderer. So when he'd sent David home, he had given him instructions not to leave the city because he intended to arrest David soon. But first, Getz did need to follow up on the other leads. He had to hopefully rule them out. And one of those leads was sitting in the interrogation room right now, waiting for him. It was Paul Cortez, the man that David had named, who officers had tracked down and brought in, the man who supposedly was obsessed with Catherine. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was look at Paul's shoes, and he could see that they were a pretty typical size, too. At a glance, they looked like they could also be a 10.5. Getz also looked for scratches or bruises on Paul's skin, in particular on his forearms and his hands, and he did see one. There was a small injury on one of Paul's fingertips. Getz asked about it, and Paul said his finger had just got unpinched between a couple of weights at the gym. Paul was very calm and soft-spoken, and he said he'd heard all about Catherine's death in the papers, and he just wanted to help if he could. When Getz told him that they'd gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just kind of rolled his eyes and said, you know, David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine. Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago, and they had been dating off and on ever since. At the time of Catherine's death, he said they had been off, but Paul said he still cared about her and had hoped that maybe one day they might get back together. Paul told Getz that he hadn't actually seen Catherine on the day of her death, but that he had actually spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon, which was not unusual. The two did speak on the phone from time to time. That's all it was, Paul said. He actually had tried calling her a second time that day, but she didn't answer him. But Paul said he really didn't think much of it. And then Paul said that night he wound up going shopping with some friends and then also to a local bar to watch the Jets game at about 8:30. Getz made a note to follow up on Paul's alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might have killed Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes lit up and he said there had been some stalker guy named Joe who'd been one of Catherine's regulars at the strip club. You know, months ago, he'd somehow gotten Catherine's phone number and had reached out to her outside of the club. And around that same time, Catherine had actually gotten roof IED during one of her strip club shifts. A roof IE is called the day trape drug. Basically, it makes you incapacitated, defectively unconscious. You don't remember anything. People will be given a roof IE and then be sexually assaulted. That's often its use. And even though he'd never been able to prove this, Paul always suspected it had been Joe who gave Catherine that roof IE. Catherine had cut off contact with Joel, but the whole incident had bothered Paul so much that he tried to convince Catherine to just quit the exotic dancing scene. But she refused. Paul admitted that he actually went on to call Catherine's father to tell him how worried he was about her. And Catherine had been so mad about that she stopped talking to Paul for weeks. And so gets jotted all this down and then asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this guy Jojo. Paul said he didn't have Joe's number, but it was definitely in Catherine's phone, because the last time Paul ever spoke on the phone with Catherine, on the afternoon of her death, she had mentioned something that really surprised him. She said that after months of silence, Joe had started calling her again, completely out of the blue. And at this, Get studied Paul's face, looking for any hint of deception. This whole Joe story seemed like it might just be a way to deflect suspicion from Paul himself, but it really didn't feel like Paul was lying here rather than feel like Paul. And besides, Catherine's phone records would be simple enough to verify. Gets hated to admit it. But maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe it was time he started looking seriously into some of Catherine's customers at the strip club. The following afternoon, on Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was feeling really annoyed as he hung up the phone at his desk. It had been a call from another reporter, but Getz hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was staying tight-lipped. But for now, he just turned his focus back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he'd subpoenaed yesterday, and they showed that Paul had been telling the truth. Both he and Joe had called Catherine shortly before she died. So he brought in Joe for an interview, and he asked him to explain why, after months of silence, he had called Catherine right before she turned up dead. And Joe had replied he'd only called her to check in, to say he hoped she had a nice Thanksgiving. He had claimed that he was really just trying to be friendly. But then Getz just asked Joe point blank if he had ever roof IED anyone's drink before. And at this, Joe's eyes went wide, and he kind of sputtered out that he would never dream of doing anything like that. But based on Joe's tone, Getz really felt like he was lying. And so now Getz felt like the entire investigation was wide open. A few days ago, he had been absolutely confident that David was the killer, but men from Catherine's life just kept coming out of the woodwork. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just one. In fact, at this point, his original suspect, David, was actually looking more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's co-workers at the hotel where he worked as a doorman, and they confirmed that he really had stopped and talked to them on the evening of Catherine's death, just like he had claimed. And while Getz had hoped that the security camera footage from the apartment building would prove David was lying about his alibi, at least in terms of when he was there, it actually showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38 p.m., which lined up with David's story because he said he left around 6:40. Now, this did not prove that David was innocent. Based on what the neighbors had heard, she could have been killed before 6:38. But there weren't a lot of cameras in the apartment building, and no angle covered the hallway outside of apartment to D. So the footage couldn't prove one way or another, whether Brad, Stewart, or anybody else, for that matter, had gone into the apartment while David was gone. Just then, his phone rang. Getz reached for it expecting it to be another reporter, but this time he was pleasantly surprised. It was a member of the forensics team, and there was this obvious excitement in their voice. He told Getz that they'd just discovered something big, something they completely missed during their first sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensics team member explained that when they'd first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had taken that mattress that was stuck behind the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But when they'd done that, the mattress had actually covered up something that was right there on the wall all along, a bloody handprint. It was not until a couple of days later, after they'd carefully gone over everything else in the room, that they moved the mattress back down onto the floor. And that's when they found the handprint. Kitz's face lit up when he heard this news because now he knew all he had to do was go get handprints from all of his suspects, which seemed like that would be pretty easy to do. But he quickly realized he had a problem because some of his suspects had already lawyered up at this point, and they were refusing to speak with police, let alone hand over their prints. And Getz really could not force them to give their prints unless he arrested them. And so that meant Getz was now in this weird catch-22 because he needed the suspects' prints in order to make the arrest. But he also couldn't get their prints unless he arrested them. So, at this point, the investigation kind of stalled out. Weeks went by, and Detective Getz started to get really frustrated because there was just nothing he could legally do to push the case forward. However, the case was still receiving a ton of coverage in the press and to a lot of people. It looked like the NYPD was just sort of dropping the ball here. But then on December 16th, so 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the news coverage that had annoyed Getz so much actually ended up giving him exactly what he needed. That day, a woman called the NYPD because of something she had seen on the front page of one of the newspapers in New York. And what this woman said led Getz directly to Catherine's killer. Based on forensic evidence and numerous interviews, this is what police believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of November 27, 2005. Shortly after 6:40 p.m., the killer climbed the stairs inside of Catherine's apartment building. They knew that at that very moment, she'd be getting ready for another shift at Flash Dancers. And the fact that she even worked there secretly really bothered the killer way more than they would ever let on. The idea of Catherine dancing and giving her attention to other men made the killer so jealous they couldn't even stand it. Now, the killer had tried to talk with Catherine and win her over, but she had rejected him. So, the time for talking was over. And so the killer quietly walked up to the door of apartment to D and reach down and turn the handle, which was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, the killer brought out the knife that they had hidden inside of their sweatshirt. But then, something they had not anticipated happened. There was this dog lying on the apartment floor that got up and began to bark at them. For a moment, the killer thought about just abandoning the plan and leaving, but then Catherine, alerted by the dog, came out of the bedroom and looked right at the killer and saw the knife in their hand. Catherine screamed and ran right back into her bedroom, the very bedroom that she had made explicitly off limits to the killer. And just thinking about that, a surge of anger suddenly overtook them, and the killer charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the other side of the bed, lifting up the mattress as a sort of barricade. But the killer just forced their way past it and they grabbed Catherine from behind. But Catherine, she fought back. She began thrashing around, doing everything she could to break free, but she couldn't to break free. And so, they struggled and began smashing into the furniture and knocking things down all over the room. And it was around this point that the killer lifted up that knife they had brought, and they slit her neck as deep as they could dig. But even then, even with this fatal wound, Catherine kept on fighting. And she was so vicious that the killer actually had to brace themselves against a wall just to keep their balance. And in the chaos, the killer didn't realize, as they're fighting off Catherine, that they had placed a bloody hand on the wall, leaving a print behind. Finally, when Catherine fell to the floor, the killer was still blinded with their rage, and they just got down there and began stabbing her over and over again. And then finally, when Catherine stopped moving, the killer just jumped up and ran out of the apartment. But when they got into the hallway, they realized that black dog that had barked at them had gotten out. Now, the killer wanted the dog back in the apartment, but the dog was clearly on edge. They were still barking at the killer. And so instead, the killer just shut the apartment door, trapping the dog in the hallway. And then the killer fled the apartment building out the back door where there was no security camera. And for weeks, the killer was not caught until their violent past came back to bite them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who didn't know Catherine was walking down the streets of New York when she noticed a newspaper. And on the cover of this newspaper was plastered the face of the killer, who was currently a suspect in a murder case. And this woman was horrified because she knew this person. They, the killer, had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier, but she had never filed a police report. But after seeing that this horrible person was being actively accused of murder, she called the NYPD and she told them what she knew. And the NYPD Special Victims Unit used this woman's accusation as the basis to arrest the killer. And finally, once they were under arrest, Gitz was able to get their handprint. And those prints did, in fact, match the bloody handprint found on Catherine's wall. They belonged to Catherine's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Paul Cortez. David's suspicions of Paul had been right all along. Paul was a creep who had assaulted at least one other woman before he killed Catherine. Data collected from nearby cell towers would prove that Paul was near Catherine's apartment building immediately before her murder, and he had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, Paul waited until he saw David leave the apartment to go get his car, and then he hustled upstairs to the apartment, knowing Catherine would be alone. Even though David was only gone for 20 minutes, that was still long enough for Paul to get inside the apartment, murder Catherine, and slip away unnoticed. Paul was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder on Wednesday, December 23, 2005. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now, so click here and give them a watch. Alright, until next time, see you. Today, I'm gonna tell you the stories that both have very unexpected killers. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please gift the like button a brand new signed copy of MrBallen's brand new graphic novel Where Nightmares Live, but make sure you first strip out one page from each story. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of September 12, 2007, 20-year-old Ashley Wallace was in her dorm room at Bryant Stratton College in Buffalo, New York, getting ready for her very first day of classes. And this was really exciting for her. I mean, she had just moved out on her own for the first time, It feels like she's an adult here. And so today was a big day, She looked herself in the mirror and made sure her look was just right. She gathered up all her books and her journals and all the stuff she would need, and then once she was ready, she began heading towards the door. But before she got there, she heard a knock on her door, and Ashley felt sort of confused. Like she hadn't lived here long enough for people to actually know she lived here, so who would be coming to visit her? And she certainly didn't have any plans to see anybody today. And so she's thinking, I have no idea who could be at my door right now. So she walks to the door, she opens it up, and she is truly shocked now to see who's standing there, but her shock quickly turns into fear. So, there were the police officers standing in the hallway looking right at Ashley, and the looks on their faces were very serious. Now Ashley, the reason she felt so scared when she saw these police officers was not because she had, done something wrong. It was because in her life, before she got to college, she had experienced some pretty severe trauma. So, her father had passed away when she was 13, a sudden heart attack, and it had been very traumatic for her. It sort of threw the family for a loop. And then her mother had remarried, and her stepfather, who had, raised her from that point on, he had sort of struggled with depression on and off. And it seemed like he was doing okay. But not long after her biological father had suddenly died, her stepfather took his own life. And so once again, Ashley and her family's lives were turned upside down. And so, in many ways, Ashley had not really recovered from those two losses. Those happened not that long ago, and now she was out here on her own trying to be an adult, trying her best to stay composed. But she just had this awful feeling when she saw these police officers that they were there to tell her that, somebody else close to her had died. But when the officers actually began speaking to Ashley, It was clear they were not here to notify her about, a new death, but they were here to talk about her family. They told her that they were there to speak to her about her father, her biological father, who had passed away 7 years earlier. And so when they said that to Ashley, she was like, okay, what do you mean? What do you want to know about my dad? And they told her that, Ashley, we exhumed your father, and it turns out he very likely did not die of a heart attack. We think he was murdered. About 30 minutes later, when these officers had finally left Ashley's room, Ashley was left feeling completely distraught. I mean, number one, she's just found out that there is suspicion that her father was killed by somebody. But worse than that was these two officers who had been here were not here to console Ashley. They were here to effectively interrogate her. They were looking into the family to see if, Ashley was involved in what happened to her father. And so, for Ashley, this had really caught her off guard. She felt like she was stammering and confused in all of her answers, which only made her seem more suspicious. And it was like every little misstep she had, the police would dial in and ask even more pointed questions. And by the end of it, she was just sobbing and telling them, like, I didn't do this. I didn't hurt my dad. I have no idea who would do that. And so eventually, the police had gotten up and left. They told Ashley they were going to be in touch, and then they were gone. And so, Ashley just left there in her room, wondering what she's supposed to do now. She thought about, sucking it up and just going to class, but she's thinking, like, how can I possibly focus on class right now when I've just learned what I've learned and had this horrible experience with the police? And so Ashley ended up calling her mother, and her mother was obviously very upset when she picked up, even before Ashley said anything. And Ashley quickly learned that her mother also had a sort of similar experience with police that day, that she had also been told that, that her husband apparently had been killed, and they were now investigating her to see if maybe she had something to do with it. And so the two women just sort of cried on the phone, and they began saying, like, I just don't understand, like, who would want to hurt him? It just doesn't make any sense. Like, they've got to be wrong. Like, none of this makes any sense. And so eventually, Ashley's mother, whose name was Stacy, just told her daughter to come home. Forget about classes. We can deal with that stuff later. Just come home. Be with your family. Ashley agreed that was the most reasonable thing to do here. And so she grabbed her stuff, she left the door, hopped in her car, and she drove the car back to her mom's place. And when she gets there and she goes inside, the first person she sees is actually her younger sister, Bree, who was 16 years old. And Bree's eyes were red. She obviously had been crying. And in the first couple of seconds they spoke, it was clear that Bree, too, had had a sort of rough interaction with police as well that day. And so it's like the whole family has been thrust into this chaotic moment that none of them can make any sense of. On the one hand, it's like, who would want to hurt dad? But on the other, it's like, did this really happen? Is this a mistake? Like, why did they exhume his body in the first place? Like, what's going on here? There was just so much unknown. And so that afternoon, Ashley, her sister Bree, and their mom just retreated to their mother's kitchen. And there they mostly cried together and just sort of talked through this horrible situation. But eventually, later in the day, when the tears had sort of stopped flowing and reality had set in, that this was now a very complicated situation. If nothing else, basically they were all under investigation for the potential murder of their husband. And they sort of didn't know what was going to happen next, but there was a lot of stress around, the next couple of days. They didn't know. And so, under all this stress, Stacy, the mom, was like, you know what? I'm getting a drink. Do any of you guys want a drink? And Bree was only 16 and she declined, but Ashley said sure. She was 20, not 21 yet, but she was drinking at this point. And so she said, yep, I'll take a drink. And so Stacy mixed some drinks for her and Ashley, as well as a non-alcoholic drink for Bree. And so for the rest of the night, the girls just sat in the kitchen having their drinks and trying hard not to let this horrible situation totally wreck them. The next morning, when Ashley woke up inside of her mother's house, she found she was really hungover now. She obviously had had some drinks the night before with her mom and her sister, but she was thinking to herself, like, the level of hungover she was feeling felt disproportionate, like she was really hungover despite a relatively small amount of alcohol. But Ashley was wondering if maybe part of the reason she felt so bad was not just a hangover. Maybe it was like this emotional fallout from this horrible thing that happened the day before. And so Ashley, she's laying in bed feeling so bad, and she's just convincing herself that, I just need to get up. I need to go to my classes. I need to sort of treat the day like a normal day and sort of get my life back together and be ready to potentially deal with police or, whatever else is going to happen here. And so Ashley sort of wills herself out of bed. She's got a blinding headache, she feels horrible, but nonetheless, she takes a shower, she gets herself together, and before long, she's saying bye to her mom and sister, and she's driving back to the campus. And when she gets there, she still feels terrible, but, she goes to her classes and she does her best to focus, which really turned out to be a gargantuan ask. But she did it. And then finally at the end of the day during her last class, Ashley began to sort of break out of this fog, this hangover fog that she was in, and she began sort of feeling normal again. And so, by the time she left the lecture hall and was done for the day, she actually felt good enough that she hopped right back in her car and drove right back to her mother's house. And that night again, just like the night before, she, her sister, and her mom just sat in the kitchen just sort of having this cathartic moment together, crying together, talking about their dad, sharing memories, sharing theories, and also having a few drinks. And again, Bree did not have any alcohol, but Ashley and her mother did. The next morning when Ashley woke up, once again her head was pounding. She was so hungover, way worse than the day before, except when she opened her eyes and kind of looked around. That really was not the first thing that hit her. The first thing that hit her is, I don't know where I am. The room looked different, and as she kind of adjusted and looked around, she realized she was in a hospital room. And so Ashley began to panic and began looking around for her family or anybody she recognized, but nobody that she knew was in there, as there were just these two police officers sitting against the wall in her room. And these two officers, when they saw Ashley coming to, they got up and they walked over to her. And they explained to her that she was very lucky that her mother had actually found her in her bed at her mother's house that morning, and Ashley had been unresponsive. And so her mother had called an ambulance, and they had rushed her here. And, luckily she was stabilized now, but apparently she was very close to full-blown organ failure. Like, she almost died. It was very lucky she got here when she did. But before Ashley could ask any questions, what was it that was causing my body to shut down? What's going on here? These two police officers kind of looked at each other, and then one of them pulled a piece of paper out of their pocket, and they handed it to Ashley and they said, you need to explain yourself. It would turn out the way Ashley's stepfather had taken his own life was by drinking antifreeze. At least, that was the initial theory. But pretty quickly, investigators started to say, why would somebody take their own life that way? Drinking antifreeze is slow and painful. That's not a good first choice if you're going to take your own life. And so as suspicions rose around the stepfather, investigators thought, okay, the biological father died just a few years before, and apparently he died of a heart attack, but maybe we ought to make sure, because we're basically suggesting that maybe somebody did this to the stepfather. Is it possible somebody, killed the biological father? And so they exhumed the biological father, and during the autopsy, they discovered antifreeze in his remains. And so now, fast forward to the hospital where Ashley has woken up. These officers have walked over to her. They've handed her a note and told her to explain herself. And this note was effectively a confession. The writer of this note said they killed Ashley's biological father and then they also killed Ashley's stepfather. But now, because of the blood on their hands, they're going to take their own lives. So this was a suicide note/confession, and at the bottom of this note, it was signed by Ashley. Except, Ashley did not kill her father or stepfather. Her mother did. Her mother used antifreeze to poison and kill both men. And then when police began poking around saying, "What's going on here round? We think somebody killed this guy, maybe him too." Well, what did Ashley's beloved mother do? She tried to poison her own daughter. She laced those alcoholic drinks they were having in her kitchen with all these painkillers to make it look like Ashley had taken her own life because she felt so guilty about murdering these two men. Except Ashley's mother called the ambulance a little bit too early the following day, feigning that she had just found her daughter unresponsive. Because the ambulance, they showed up and first responders. They saved Ashley's life narrowly. Apparently, she was within 15 minutes of dying when she showed up at the hospital. Stacy was convicted of 2 murders, as well as the attempted murder of her daughter, and she was sentenced to 51 years in prison. However, she would die behind bars in 2016. Around lunchtime on March 31, 2010, a man in his mid-50s named John S.C.H. Mayer was sitting at a table with a bunch of his friends inside of a Hooters restaurant in the small city of York, Pennsylvania. So, John was a retired eye doctor. He had a very successful career, made a bunch of money. And his friends that were at this table with him were also pretty successful guys, sort of like mid to upper tier professionals with very successful careers too. But what they were doing today had nothing to do with career. This was pure pleasure. This group of guys, this specific group of friends, were very, very close. They would meet up, a couple times a month at this particular Hooters. They would sit at the same table. They would order the same things. They loved it. It was sort of like their little clubhouse. And in fact, they had even come up with a name for, this group of friends. They called themselves the Orange Shorts Society. And so the reason they did that is because Hooters has a sort of vibe to it that if you've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't been there, basically the waitresses dress in very scantily clad clothing, and they all wear the sort of iconic white tank tops and orange shorts. And so basically these men were sort of joking that they were the Orange Shorts Society because of the shorts these women would all wear. And so that afternoon, John and the rest of the members of the Orange Shorts Society all sat around chatting and, be sing with each other, just being guys. And at some point, John brought up a subject that the rest of the society was accustomed to him bringing up, and that was his ex-wife, Monica. So, all of his friends knew that John had been married to Monica for 20 years, but then they got divorced in 2003, so 7 years earlier. But still, Monica was a thorn in John's side because he had to pay her alimony. And, he understood that comes with the territory of divorce. It is what it is. But Monica had made the way John paid her the alimony really cumbersome. And John was convinced, as he would tell his buddies in the Orange Shorts Society, that it was totally intentional that she had made it cumbersome. She wanted it to be hard. She didn't like John, and she was punishing him. And so what Monica did is she made John literally each week take cash out of an ATM, put it in an envelope, and then physically drive it to her house and drop it off. She would not accept payment any other way. And the reason she was able to do that is because she claimed she did not have a bank account and she couldn't be forced to make a bank account. So either John made these cumbersome payments in cash, or he risked not making the payment at all, and then she could come after him legally. And so he was sort of trapped, making this trek once a week to hand over cash to his ex-wife, who he really couldn't stand. Now their divorce was not super contentious. The two of them just sort of drifted apart. They stopped seeing eye to eye. And actually, Monica really didn't like the whole Orange Shorts Society thing. She thought it was totally scummy and that John and his buddies were just kind of gross for going to that restaurant and sort of making jokes about. You know what these women are wearing and making that part of their identity? The Orange Shorts Society. She didn't like it, and so they just kind of drifted apart. That was all it was. But now, it had become the sort of bitter feud between the two of them. And so, at the same time that John and his buddies in the Orange Shorts Society are sitting in the restaurant and John is going on his tirade once again about Monica's Alimony, simultaneously on the other side of town, police rushed to Monica's house. Minutes earlier, there had been a 911 call that came from Monica's house, but when the operator answered, there was no answer. And so, by protocol, they had just sent first responders out to the house to see if whoever had called was okay. And so the police, they get to Monica's house. They park. They go right up to the front door. They're knocking on the door. There's no answer. Oh, they're looking around. There's no sign of forced entry. No sign of anything really going on here. It's just a quiet day in the neighborhood. But they go to the door again. They knock a few more times. And when there's no answer, they try the doorknob and it's unlocked. So they open the door up and right away they look in, and there's Monica. And she's dead on the ground with the phone right next to her. And she's been shot in the head. Shortly after this discovery, the lead detective, Douglas Demo Gorgon, along with his team, began to survey the crime scene. And they quickly found a purse next to Monica's body, and inside was her license. That was how they identified her. And then they also found a .32 caliber shell casing lying near the body that clearly seemed to be from the round that struck her in the head and killed her. But perhaps the most unusual aspect of this crime scene had really nothing to do with the body. It was all the money that they found all over the house, specifically cash in envelopes. There were these envelopes in trash cans and drawers on tables. I mean, it was kind of like all over the place. Some out in the open, some hidden, but there was lots of money stashed in this home. And so, Demo Gorgon and the other investigators began to wonder if, okay, maybe this was a robbery and Monica got killed in the process. But it's like, okay, if it was a robbery, why is there so much cash out in the open, literally packaged up in envelopes, easy to, remove from the house? Why is it all here? It's almost like no cash was taken, or certainly not very much was taken. And also, other valuables are still in place. It didn't have the feel of somebody ransacking the house. It just sort of felt like somebody came in here and killed Monica. Detective Demo Gorgon and his team searched the whole house, and they couldn't find any sign of forced entry. So basically, whoever came in here and did this either, just walked in because a door or window was unlocked, or maybe Monica let them in. Maybe she knew who they were or they had a key. Detective Demo Gorgon asked the forensics team to begin sweeping the house for DNA to see if maybe they could find something that could show them who had been here lately. And so, while that team got started, Demo Gorgon continued to walk around the house, and he eventually found a Rolodex, which is basically like a big book full of phone numbers and addresses. And as the detective was flipping through that book, that was how he discovered that Monica had an ex-husband, John S.C.H. Mayer. That evening, Detective Demo Gorgon and another investigator rolled up to John S.C.H. Mayer's house. They walked up to the front door and they knocked. Then a moment later the door opened, and John was standing there looking very surprised. So, in homicide cases, generally speaking, the spouse or ex-spouse is always suspect number one. And so, even though Demo Gorgon didn't really have any evidence linking John to the crime, he did have the fact that this was her ex-spouse, and so therefore he is suspicious. Before John could ask any questions, Demo Gorgon and his partner introduced themselves and said they'd like to come in and speak to John. So John said, "Okay, come on in." So they walked inside, they sat down, and then once they were seated, Detective Demo Gorgon watched John very closely as he told him why they were there. Basically, your ex-wife has been murdered, and we're here to talk to you about it. Detective Demo Gorgon wanted to see if John would have a big reaction or maybe a subdued reaction. Whatever reaction he might have could be telling to how involved he maybe was or wasn't in this case. When Demo Gorgon told John that Monica had been shot to death, John's reaction was huge. His eyes went wide. He clutched at his chest like he was having a heart attack, and then he kind of leaned forward and began sobbing. When he came back up again, the detective noticed there were no tears in John's eyes. It was just this sort of huge reaction, but Demo Gorgon couldn't really tell if it was genuine or not. He also didn't have a baseline for John. He didn't know if this was normal, but this seemed really dramatic, almost like he might be acting. So, instead of trying to console John, Demogorgon just asked point blank, "Where were you earlier this afternoon at the time of the shooting?" And when he asked this, John, who still was sort of rocking back and forth and grabbing his chest and acting very upset, he suddenly stopped, put his hands by his side and just said, "Oh, I was at Hooters with my friends." A few days later, Detective Demogorgon went to the Hooters where John and his friends would always meet up, and he asked the manager to see the security footage from the previous Wednesday, the day of the shooting. So, by this point, Demogorgon had actually already interviewed all of the friends who had been at the Hooters with John, the so-called or in short society, and he had asked them all about John. Like, had he really been there? What was he doing? What was he saying? And they all said John absolutely was there the whole time. Like, there's no way he could have left and done anything to Monica. He was here with us, I promise you. He was here. Now, they would admit to the detective that, John did speak disparagingly about Monica. He would talk about how mad he was about her alimony, and he definitely didn't like her very much. But that was it. That was the extent of his hatred. Now, despite how convincingly these friends said John was there the whole time and he couldn't have done this, Demogorgon still needed proof. He needed to really see that John had been here when he said he was here. So John went to the manager. They pulled up the security footage from the previous Wednesday. And wouldn't you know it, there's John. He comes in, he sits down, he's with his buddies, and he is there the whole time during the time that Monica was killed. And so, at this point, Demogorgon did feel like it sort of was impossible that John actually went and killed Monica. But given the contention between them, John apparently really doesn't like Monica. He hates making these payments to her. Like, there's obvious friction that comes up at these or in short society meetings all the time, Maybe it was possible that John, who was pretty well off and had a bunch of money, maybe he hired somebody to do his dirty work for him. Maybe he hired a hitman. And so, over the next week or so, Demogorgon and his team began exploring this hitman lead, and they found that John had been taking out a whole bunch of cash over the last several weeks. But it sort of lined up with how much cash he owed Monica in the form of alimony. And they knew he had to, per Monica's orders, deliver this alimony payment in cash to her in these envelopes. And they found all those envelopes of cash at Monica's house, and so it seemed like that was all he was doing, taking money out to give to Monica. And so John was basically Demogorgon's only suspect at this point, and there was basically no evidence against him. And so Demogorgon knew he really needed to look into other leads here, like the John led kind of going nowhere. And so he and his team began looking into local gang activity and, crimes in the area. Could this have just been random or something completely unrelated? But after 3 months of looking for any connection anywhere in the area, there wasn't one, and the case kind of came to a stall. And so, at this point, Demogorgon decided that the only thing he could do realistically was just kind of start over, go back to square one, and basically re-examine all the evidence all over again, and that included going back and looking at the security footage from the Hooters on that Wednesday, when the Orange Short Society was there. And so Demogorgon, he sat down, he starts watching this tape over and over and over again. It's like the 1000th time he's looked at this grainy footage, and suddenly something stands out to him. Something he missed all the other times he looked times. And as he replayed the footage over and over again, he realized he now knew almost certainly what happened to Monica. It would turn out the footage of the Orange Short Society meeting did hold the secret to Monica's murder. John S.C.H. Mayer did not kill his ex-wife, nor did he hire a hitman to do it. He really had nothing to do with her death. The only thing he did do is, at these Orange Short Society meetups, he would talk openly about how he didn't really like Monica. In particular, he resented the fact that she was making him deliver all this cash to her to pay his alimony payments. It just felt totally cumbersome. But that meant John, on a regular basis, was telling these men in the Orange Short Society that Monica was flushed with cash, that he was giving her tons of cash, every single week. This woman has so much cash at her house. And eventually, one of the Orange Short Society members, a man named Tim Jockey, decided, you know what? I'm gonna go to Monica's house and I'm gonna take that cash. Demogorgon had been operating under the assumption that all the men who were present on that Wednesday meetup at Hooters, the Orange Short Society, that was society, the totality of the group. Those were all the members. Because the way the men talked about their group was, they all meet up every single time, same group, same seats, same restaurant. And so Demogorgon assumed, okay then, it's the same people. This is it. This is the totality of the group. Everybody is accounted for. But no. On the day of the murder, one regular member of the Orange Short Society was not present. Tim Jockey bye-bye. And that is the discrepancy that Demogorgon caught when he watched that footage for the 1,000th time. He realized, wait a minute. Hey, there's another guy. I heard another guy's name, Tim Jockey bye. He's not hero. Police would later tie him to the crime scene with DNA evidence. They determined that Tim went to her house with the intention of robbing her, but when Monica fought back, he shot and killed her and then fled without taking any money. Tim was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here, so give it a watch here. Alright, until next time, see ya.